Welcome back. Are we headed for a trade war? President Trump today signed two proclamations levying tariffs on aluminum and steel, exempting only Mexico and Canada. They will take effect in 15 days. A 25% duty on imported steel, 10% on aluminum. The president says it's a matter of domestic economic security. Critics, many of them or most of them in the Republican Party, fear the tariffs will set off a trade war that will drive up prices of cars to cans of beer. And joining us for more are Michael Snipes, an economics professor at USF Sarasota Manatee, Steve Sabato, a longtime journalist, and Frank Patti of the Sarasota Republican Party. So, Michael, let me begin with you. Obviously, these tariffs are somewhat tailored to exclude our neighbors to the north and to the south. Does that do anything about your concerns over a possible trade war?
Well, not necessarily, because if we're looking at who we need to be concerned about if we do get into a trade war, we need to look at, well, what are the countries that we owe the most money to, as they're the ones who are going to be likely to affect us the most. And when we look at the countries that we owe the most money to, we're looking at countries like China, and we're looking at countries like Japan. And we do owe money to Canada and Mexico, but it's a much smaller amount than what we owe to a country like China.
Frank, there's been a lot of interesting reaction, particularly from the Republican Party. Speaker Ryan this week said what this requires is a scalpel and basically not an axe. If you have a problem with China, target China. But by only excluding Canada and Mexico, you are going to be setting up a possible trade war with a lot of our European friends.
I doubt if they're going to go into a trade war. EU is not in great shape, and they're not in shape to go into a trade war. The president will use the saber at that point. We've overdone it in many of our treaties. Take a look at China alone, $375 billion in deficit. Japan, I believe, is $69 billion. I mean, these large deficits. Germany, $65 billion. Something has to be done. And we've tried it before. Nobody listens. Now, I don't know. I'm a free trader for the very most part, but I have the feeling that he's using this as a big stick and then to taper off later on. But he is keeping his promises when he ran.
Right, but Steve, are you concerned what the impact this could have on not only American workers, but American consumers if the price of automobiles go up and the price of a can of a beer, as we've talked about?
Well, I mean, that is a concern, and we've already seen China's exports of steel to South Korea increase, which could impact the competitive cost of their automobiles for us. But I have to agree that this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. This was a political promise the president made when he ran. This is a position he's held since the 1980s when he bought a full-page ad in the New York Times to complain about unfair trade with Japan. So it's consistent with a philosophy that he's held for many years.
Michael, we're going to be talking about this in more detail later, but do you think there's an issue here that people really don't understand what would be involved in if there are ramifications from our friends and other countries in terms of retaliation?
Sure, and that is the big concern, is that if we go ahead and do this and we do see retaliation from some of our allies, some that we have trade agreements with, if they drop those trade agreements, the people that we're allies with, that we're friends with, if they drop their treaties, that could really just exacerbate things and make this whole situation a lot worse than it is.
In what way?
Well, if we have free trade agreements with a lot of other countries and they lose those free trade agreements, that could increase prices.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up, and we'll have much more on tariffs right after we check the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking about President Trump's tariffs on imported aluminum and steel. And joining us for more are Michael Snipes, an economics professor at Sarasota Manatee, Steve Sabato, a longtime journalist, and Frank Patti of the Sarasota Republican Party. And Frank, I'm going to start with you. We're going to talk about the politics of a little bit. And you both referred to it, that this is something that the president campaigned on. He has been quite vocal about long before he went into politics for 20 years. On the other hand, I mean, this is a man who imported tons and tons of Chinese steel himself to build the Trump properties in Las Vegas and in Chicago. and yet the base of the Republican Party is all for him doing this.
He did that as a businessman, and the best thing to secure a hen house is to get the fox there, and he knows exactly where this is coming from. If I make there is a law of comparative advantage, and that basically states in economics is that you produce what you can economically and trade for the rest, except defense, transportation, and communication. We violated all of that.
Right, but Steve, a lot of people find this populist decision and move a little bit hypocritical if he built most of his buildings in the United States on Chinese steel.
Well, you know, he, if nothing else, has proven that he's got Teflon in his skin, and he has the ability to not be held accountable for things that some other presidents might be. So, in terms of politics and public opinion, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know that this is really going to hurt him.
So what happens, and several members of Congress, including in the Senate, have already said that they are going to introduce legislation to prevent this from happening. I mean, this is his own party that's trying to do that. Do you really want to get into a fight with the Republican Party and the majority in an election year to try to derail this?
Well, the answer is obvious. Yes, he loves a fight, and I think at the end of the day, the Republican leadership will not challenge him on this. I think they recognize that it is a core part of his popularity in places like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and there may be some rattling of swords right now, but when it comes down to it, I don't think that you'll see any challenges of any note from the Congress.
If I could add to that also, I think you're 100% right. I think there's going to be a lot of noise coming out and so on for these senators and congressmen to please part of their constituency. I don't think they'll move on this thing and take the president on head on.
So, Michael, game this out. What is the economic impact on American workers and American consumers if you have the tariffs at the levels that we've talked about? I think it was 25% for steel, 10% for aluminum, and if there's retaliation, what is it likely to look like, especially if we exclude Canada and Mexico from the equation?
Well, when you're dealing with international relations and trade agreements with other countries, you really have to think big picture. And so if we exclude Canada and we exclude Mexico, like has been proposed, but we still impose tariffs on all of these other countries, well, it's not like there's no trade between Canada and Germany, and there's no trade between France and Mexico. So that could be one avenue that, again, in a very big picture where all these countries are interconnected, okay, we might give an exception or a pass to Canada or Mexico, but they might be able to retaliate through trade agreements that they have with Germany, or that Mexico might have with Italy, for example.
Right. So what does that mean to us? What does that mean for a price of a car here or a can of beer here? What will consumers here see?
Well, the economics on it is pretty straightforward, that if we introduce tariffs, it's going to increase prices. And the more tariffs we have, and that's the whole reason why we have free trade agreements, is because it tries to keep prices down. If we relax those restrictions and we allow for tariffs, it brings the prices up. And so if we have retaliatory tactics by Europe, for example, then that's really just something that's just going to serve to increase prices more, because they're relaxing their free trade agreements.
So, gentlemen, what are we to make of it? If a lot of people around here are saying go get them, but very soon out we're going to see the cost of our cars and other products go up.
I think you're absolutely right, Alan. I think when you look at our cost of living, when you look at the suppressed prices, when you go to Walmart, when you look at manufactured goods, at some point the American public's going to have to decide whether jobs and employment are worth having higher prices for. So all of these cheap products that we buy that are made overseas have cost us jobs here at home. And ultimately, the decision may have to be one where we look at jobs at home versus higher prices.
So Frank, let me add to that, because right now the Fed is already signaling concern about inflation. So we have prices that are at least beginning to creep up, and the cost of living and salaries have not really kept up to match that, and possibly the cost of other products because of these tariffs going up. That's not something that's going to sit with people around here.
It may not, but there may be a growth in our economy that overcomes that. Remember, if we start producing at home more of our own products, then that produces more jobs and more income. So we may be able to overcome the price. You're going to have an amount of inflation. How long has the Fed been saying there, we should have at least 2% inflation? Now they got their 2%, and they're crying in the beer to stop it.
You're the economist.
Yeah, and I think what we need to do is if this is intended to try and protect steel and aluminum industries in the United States, one of the things that we need to take into account is just how big those industries are in the United States. And it's just a fact that steel and aluminum manufacturing in the United States is a fraction of what it was in the past. It's just not a big part of our economy anymore. So we're focusing on a fairly narrow slice of the economy, and a piece of the economy that's small to begin with. So what effect is this really going to have in terms of prices? Well, it's going to increase the price of steel and aluminum. But if what we're doing is focusing on a very narrow part of the economy, then we're ignoring the lion's share of the economy.
Which means that this is really more about politics than it is about economics.
It may
would
be
agree with that.
international politics in sense. I get the feeling he's using this as a stick to wake the Europeans up, the Japanese and the Chinese. Those deficits are real.
Well, let me ask you a very short-term question. A very wise person pointed out to me today that the Port of Manatee does a fair share of business in terms of importing aluminum from Argentina. That's local jobs and local companies that may well be hurt by this. Those are jobs on the line around here, Frank. Should people be holding their breath?
I don't think so at this point. I think all speculation is just that at this point. We have to see what gels out of this, what he sits down, negotiates, what he pulls back on. We don't know. I mean, we're all guessing at this table. The president's not a fool, okay? The president may do some things that we consider erratic here and then. He's a smart businessman. He's not foolish. He knows where he's going. I don't think he's going to do something that's going to increase prices greatly or hurt the economy. After all, he's got the tax cut in there that's done really well in the economy. I don't think he wants to destroy that.
Okay. We are going to take a quick break, and we'll be back for final thoughts in a moment. And our guests join us right now for final thoughts. Michael, very simple question to you. Best case, worst case scenario?
Well, worst case scenario is we end up with a trade war, and we end up with a multinational trade war in which a lot of the agreements that we have with a lot of other countries get dropped, and then prices of all imports start to go up. That would be worst case scenario. Best case scenario, and I think that we all agree here, is that this is really kind of being used as a political tool, that maybe he wins a political battle and kind of walks back on some of his stances that he has from an economic standpoint.
Frank, you said that you are by and large a free trader here, but and I think everybody on both sides of the political aisle say that we have a particular problem, at least with China, in terms of dumping steel not only here but around the world. But do you still have your concerns about the concerns that Michael has?
I have the same concerns as Michael has, definitely, but and I think it is more of a political ploy, but I think China has to be brought to the table. Not only do they dump, but they subsidize. And China is playing a game of upgraded mercantilism at this point. It has been modernized that beautifully, and we're paying for that.
Steve, there is another calculation here, and we're about to talk about North Korea in primetime headlines. We need China's help in terms of keeping North Korea in check. I don't know why we want to kind of make our relations with China more difficult at this point.
Well, I mean, I don't think we really want to get into a trade war with China. I think this is a bit of bravado. I think it's a campaign promise that has now been kept, and we're only in the first act here. The world is flat, and our relationships with China are much too complex to risk going into some sort of trade war with.
Frank, are you also concerned about the help that we need with China on other issues?
China has helped us not one iota anywhere.
Actually, the president says that the Chinese have been helpful to a point.
Well, in trying to get them the help, that's the nicest thing you can say.
Okay.
But I don't see it.
We have to leave it there, but before we go, we want to share with you what some of you had to say about last night's show on Sheriff Knight's proposal to have retired law enforcement officers and veterans work and protect schools. They would carry concealed weapons but be employed by the school district. Some love the idea. Others don't think adding more guns in the schools are the answer. We went to Facebook to hear your thoughts. And Michelle says, yes, 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 great idea. They are trained and have years of experience. Keep our kids safe. Catherine says, I think it is a good idea, but much better than arming teachers. Teachers don't want to carry guns in school. They want to teach. Let people who are trained in firearms, law enforcement, and military protect students. Diane says, you still have the problem of asking a guard with a regular gun to go up against someone with an assault-type rifle. That hardly seems fair. Ban the AR-15 and guns like it. Michael says, isn't it sad that in this day and age we have to consider this in our schools? We need to have real gun law reform. Well, if you'd like to join the conversation on tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/mysuncoast.com.abc7. And FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest on local breaking news, don't forget to download the updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, it's expired. Just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank all our guests for being here tonight. Michael Snipes, an economics professor at USF Sarasota Manatee, Steve Sabato, our longtime journalist, and Frank Patty of the Sarasota Republican Party.